Welcome, 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 and two more welcomes for everybody out there. Welcome, welcome. Part of our continuing series where we talk to professors, reporters, writers, columnists, activists, anybody on the left, anybody on the right. As long as they have a thoughtful perspective, we want to provide it unedited and unaltered directly to you, the public, so that you could do this thing that was very popular a long time ago when I was in high school. It's called Thinking for Yourself. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. With us, it is our privilege today to have Richard Barton. He's the professor, assistant teaching professor, public administration and international affairs department. He's also assistant teaching professor of policy studies, and he's a research affiliate at the Center for Policy Design and Governance at Syracuse University at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. We've interviewed a couple people from that school, very good school. Richard Barton is assistant teaching professor of public administration and international affairs. His research focuses on the American political economy and legislative institutions. His published articles include Upending the New Deal Regime, Regulatory Regime, Democratic Party Position Change on Financial Regulation, and A Primary Threat, How Ideological Primary Challengers Exacerbate Polarization in Bill Sponsorship. He has published op-eds in the Washington Post and CNN, among other outlets. His research was supported by the Dirksen Congressional Center in 2020. He is a research fellow with the Scholars Strategy Network and the Unite America Institute, where he conducts research and thought leadership on the effects of primaries and alternative election institutions on governance. He achieved his PhD from Cornell, very good school, in 2022. Some of the publications he's worked on: The Problems with Primaries, to Free Political Parties from Fringe Candidates. We need to eliminate primaries that favor extremes. Congress's polarized fear of being primaried is one reason. Le Pen could have won here. France provides an example of how American electoral institutions distort voter representation. How campaigns and distrust undermine efforts to soak the rich. Science says how challenges in primary shifts the policy agendas of political parties. So a lot of research on primaries over the last couple of years, looking at both parties and why it's there. And this was the article where I found them, an antidote for our ultra polarized politics. But before we get to that, let's check in, see how we did. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Is there something that we need to correct about your background?
No, you got everything important. Other than my role in the Taylor Swift fan club, you got all
got
that.
Got it. You are a Swiftie. You are a Swiftie, and I am not. I am unfortunately not prepared to talk about Taylor Swift this morning.
We'll talk about polarization instead.
Well, okay. Yeah. I'll schedule another interview. We'll have it on Taylor Swift. This one, if it's okay, we'll do on political polarization. Next one on Taylor Swift.
That sounds good.
Done. This is how we do things. Compromise. Yeah. So, why now? I've noticed that looking at some of your research, you're looking at, I don't know, this goes back to 2018 to 2023. When did you start looking into primaries and political polarization? Like roughly around what time? And why did you start looking into it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the actual year would have been around 2016.
Okay.
So I originally thought I'd be writing a dissertation on education policy. And that's what brought me to Cornell to work with Suzanne Mettler, who was my dissertation co-chair. And I ended up going in a different direction, focusing on political parties. And right. my interest in political polarization, on the relationship between primary elections and polarization, was really peaked when sort of like real world events were happening alongside of me as a graduate student, reading about the existing research on primaries. And in the real world, I had watched sort of, Donald Trump take over the Republican Party from the outside. I saw something similar with Bernie Sanders, a self-described democratic socialist, nearly taking over the Democratic Party from the outside. And I saw how these sort of challenges to each party's establishment through the primaries were really reshaping each political party. And then I was reading this research, which this might be surprising to some of your listeners, but it's been changing over the last few years. But it used to be the sort of the consensus among political scientists used to be that primaries actually weren't an important factor in contributing to polarization. And
I ask you about that. Yeah.
I'm as a concerned citizen in the United States, and just thinking like this just doesn't feel right. So I decided to start my own research project, examining the question in using a lot of the same data, but developing a new methodological approach. And lo and behold, I found that in fact, ideological primary challengers have a huge impact on polarization over the last few decades.
Why did because I've seen these research studies too. Why did other political scientists say that primaries were not the cause, or not? Maybe they just contributed, but they weren't the cause of political polarization. And what did you find that they did not?
Yeah, good question. So the way I think of it is, I guess there's two main reasons. So the first is that there's a lot of other good explanations for polarization. So it's not clear that like the answer has to be primaries. We know that there's been ideological and geographic sorting in the United States going back to the 1960s, where someone who was ideologically liberal might have been able to fall in either party, and now they're definitely going to become a Democrat, and vice versa for a conservative. We also know that some of polarization has been driven from the top down, from party leadership. There's great work. A political scientist who's now at Princeton, Francis Lee, who has this great book called "Insecure Majorities," and
We interviewed her.
What's that? You interviewed her? Yeah. Okay. So she's fantastic, and and her research really demonstrates how, as competition for control of Congress got more and more intense, that the leadership of each party developed this strategically developed this combative approach that was intended on undermining the legitimacy of the opposition. So there's other good explanations for why polarization has happened. However, I think something changed during the Obama administration, and it really first manifested in the rise of the Tea Party, where it's true that party leadership had sort of strategically driven polarization before, but it became clear to me, and I think to most observers of American politics, that there were ways in which the parties were being pushed beyond what they wanted to do, beyond what was in their strategic interest, right? I mean, you see this clearly in the last elections, in the last election cycle, where Mitch McConnell is complaining about the candidates that he's being stuck with, right? And about Donald Trump's influence in the Republican primaries, because he doesn't think Herschel Walker, right, and Dr. Oz are great candidates, and he had good reason to think that they were not going to be great candidates in those competitive states. And so this is an example, and we can talk about many more examples of the party establishment being pushed further than it would go itself, further than what was in its strategic interest.
Right.
And so, okay, so that was a little bit of a rant, but
no, but it makes sense. It absolutely makes sense. You're totally right about Bernie Sanders. You're totally right about Trump. I've said that many times to fellow liberals. They didn't want to see how Sanders and Trump were the same guy, just speaking to different audiences. They're like, what? No, they're totally. And I go, this is populism. It's just for different target audiences. These are the same guy. It's not a coincidence they're popping up at the same time. Sanders has been around since the time of the dinosaurs, and now suddenly he blew into like massive popularity, like he was some sort of outsider. It was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever seen. The guy's not an outsider, but people felt that he was, because of, like you're saying, he was saying things that the Democratic Party didn't really want to hear and weren't really about, and they massively sidelined him successfully. There was the Iowa caucus with the rigged vote app by Hillary Clinton and Obama staffers. There was also the Nevada caucus, where his members were literally pushed off stage, and they acted like they didn't notice their votes. And then you can go to Trump, and you can see everything the Republican Party did to try to remove him and not acknowledge him as a real candidate during the election season before he was even president. So absolutely, totally agree with you. How does that equal?
There's one other, so I'll make this point quicker, but one other reason why, just to finish up that thought, one other reason why prior political science research didn't find a strong connection, is that it's a difficult thing to measure. The fear of being primaried is a difficult thing to measure. And so what I did in a research paper that was published in Party Politics is to develop an innovative technique where I use essentially a forecasting model that predicts what is the vote share that's likely to go to a more extreme candidate in a given primary. And I use that as basically a stand-in, a proxy for how threatened is a given incumbent at a moment in time. And so rather than just doing what earlier research had done, which is just look at compare states based on their primary rules, I was able to sort of track the increase in the threat of being primaried over time, and how it varied across geography and across different districts. And so it was really like a methodological advance, I would say, and it was really an issue of it being a difficult thing to measure beforehand. In addition to, there have been other factors. And then the last thing I would say is I think it's true that primaries actually weren't an important source up until the rise of the Tea Party. So part of this was just outdated, research that was sound, but had become outdated because this is a newer phenomenon.
So there is a lot of evidence showing that primaries did not cause polarization, but you're saying when we get to the Obama Tea Party era, things start to change.
Yes.
Additionally, these previous researchers were looking at general observations of elections across the states versus really weeding into the data and parceling it out so that you could get, I'm guessing, some sort of graph that shows over the last 3 decades increasing fear of being primaried, with allowance for regional variations. I think that's roughly what you're saying. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So
I should another researcher, Robert Boatwright, who's at Clark University, has done his own research where he shows that the number of primary challengers who challenge because of ideology and from the extreme also increased at the same time period. So he's also done that research, and what my contribution was to show that that was having an effect on the behavior of members in Congress. It was causing incumbents to act more extreme than they would have otherwise.
His name is Robert Boatwright?
Yeah, that's correct.
And he did research that sort of backed up or paralleled your research or buttressed it?
That's right.
Okay. However, you are also saying, I think, that the big sort and regional politics is a real thing. And basically the idea that roughly since the 1990s, some people push it back further, we've been sorting into ideological camps, hardcore red, hardcore blue, and we've been doing this regionally. You used to have what we call competitive election districts, and now they're almost all completely wiped out. It's mostly all landslide election votes. So you admit that. I think you're saying that's also true. That's happening, but it doesn't mean that politicians aren't scared of being primary challenged and aren't being more susceptible to extreme positions because of that fear.
That's well said. So
okay.
I totally agree. The big sort is a real thing. The decline in competitive general election districts is is definitely a contributing factor, but it's not the whole story, right? And I mean, I can like go back to the last senatorial election cycle. Ohio, Georgia, Pennsylvania, those were very competitive states, and especially on the Republican side, the candidates that were nominated were not ideologically representative of the general public. They were not, and so I take that as evidence that even in competitive states and districts, primaries are resulting in candidates that are more extreme, and that is an important contribution, regardless of how competitive the district is.
That was what I'm very. This is really interesting because I was going to ask. 538 primaries won't probably make politics less divisive, and what they're saying is we think it's the big sort more than anything else that's causing polarization. Here's another one saying we didn't find this, but that study's a little bit old, so it lines up with what you're saying, that there is a big sort. There is regional political variation now in a concretized manner we haven't seen. But at the same time, when you looked at this data and you went down to the atomic level, I guess, of the data, you were able to conclusively show there was an increase in fear by politicians of being primary challenged that increased over the last 3 decades. So a lot of this data is accurate. You're just, I think, giving us some nuance on how to view it. Is that a fair summary? Doesn't have to be. Please tell. The aim of the show is to understand.
It's a complicated question, I think. So you're saying I agree with the other evidence that's out there, right?
It exists, but it's not the whole story.
That's right. Yeah. So that I agree with. There was another part of your question maybe that I didn't fully understand. I wasn't sure if I got it correctly. If you want to,
they were saying. Let me see. Let's find this.
So So I think what I paused on was you characterized my research as sort of looking at a more granular level.
Yeah, that was mine.
The I would say is what I'm doing is I'm trying to measure something that's really crucial for understanding how primaries contribute to polarization, which is this idea of how the threat of being primary, the threat is sort of something that is felt by candidates, right? It's sort of this latent emotional variable that you can't actually put your finger on. It's harder to actually sort of directly observe. And so what I did was I created a way to measure the threat, and basically what I used is a forecast of what percentage, what can we expect an ideological primary challenger, how should we expect them to perform in a given primary election? What share of the vote should we expect them to get? And so based on that forecast of how much we expect an ideological challenger to do, how well we expect them to do, that's my idea. That's my way to measure how threatened these candidates should feel. And when we use that measure of threat, and then we say, okay, so how strongly does this correlate, or how strongly does this predict changes in my outcome here is how often members co-sponsor bills with the other party. What we find is that as this measure of threat increases, that incumbents are significantly less likely to co-sponsor bills with members of the other party.
Got it.
Right. And so this is trying to measure something that's difficult to measure, which is the relationship between this threat of being primaried and how polarized lawmakers are.
So the stronger the primary threat, the less willingness to co-sponsor bills.
That's right.
Especially with the other party, right? So I don't want to be seen. I'm a Republican. I don't want to be seen hanging out with Democrats when I got an extreme alt-right Republican to my side who's going to primary challenge me. I need to shore up the base, shore up the voter base, and make sure that they don't see me as weak on the issues or dino or rhino, right? Fake Republican, fake, yeah. How do we fix it? How do we fix it? If primaries are a big cause of polarization, but you also said it used to not be that issue until we got to the Tea Party. So we used to have a period where we had primaries, but they were not causing such extreme polarization. And then we turned into an era where that's happening. Does that mean we have to get rid of primaries now, or could we go back to the less polarized time before the Tea Party?
That's a good question. It's a good way to ask the question. So, I will say, I don't think there's any way to go back to having candidates nominated the way they used to, right? Through a convention, like basically making the nomination process less democratic, putting the genie back in the bottle is not feasible anymore. Americans are just not gonna, like, nobody's gonna go out and vote for a candidate who's running on making the nomination process in the control, back to the smoke-filled rooms or vape-filled rooms, whatever they would be today, where insiders are deciding who the candidate is, right? There's no returning to that. And then your other question is like, well, it hasn't always been the case that primaries have been a source of polarization. I think that so long as we have the partisan primary system that we have now, that we should expect to see primaries continue to be a source of polarization without reform. And the reason is, though, even though there was this period when, without getting too much in the history, unless you want me to, like going back to the McGovern-Fraser reforms of the early 1970s, when primaries became binding, there was this period of a few decades before they really mattered. What happened, like the change of why they went from not really mattering to mattering, is that ideological activists and donors realized that these low turnout elections were something that they could capitalize on. So, sometimes political scientists, we like to act like everybody is a perfectly rational actor and completely understands the incentive structure. And in fact, it takes time for, we call it political learning. It takes time for these actors to sort of realize how they can influence elections, how they can influence government. And that's how I understand what happened, right? And so now that we have these, activist groups and these donors that have formed and realize how much leverage they can get from pumping a bunch of money or putting a lot of organizational capacity into low turnout primary elections, we're not going to get them to stop doing that. The solution, though, is that we can open up primaries and actually make them more democratic, which sounds counterintuitive because part of the problem is, there were problems to the smoke-filled rooms too, right? But part of the problem is that by democratizing primaries a little bit, we actually sort of are in this sort of worst case scenario where the party elites don't have control of the party, which there's good reason to want somebody beyond party elite deciding who the candidates are. Fine. But what happened is it's sort of this core base of activists within the party that have outsized influence. That's what democratizing has looked like. However, we can further democratize primaries by making them higher turnout elections in which all voters can participate. And here's the most important thing: by making them nonpartisan primaries in which all of the candidates compete directly against each other in the first stage. And this part is really important because it changes the incentive structure for candidates, right? So instead of being a Republican candidate or a Democrat, let's say a Democrat who's running in a Democratic primary, and only have to compete against other Democratic candidates, and your biggest concern is that you're going to get outflanked on your left. Sorry, there's a big truck beeping behind me.
Oh, good. We can hear you.
Your biggest concern is that you're going to be outflanked on your left. If we have nonpartisan primaries where you're worried about getting outflanked on your left, but you also have to worry about a moderate, a centrist candidate, about a Republican candidate, and you have the ability to win votes from both the left, the center, and the right. That changes the kind of candidates who are successful.
Are you pointing to California as a way to do that? So I'm looking at the antidote for our ultra polarized politics. Primary elections are not helping. Louisiana doesn't have primary elections, and you seem to point to them as doing okay. But then we also have California. Good things California's top 2 elections have wrought. Are you looking at the reforms California has done and saying that's a way out of the partisanship?
Yes.
Why is the California system good? What is it that California did, and why is it good?
Okay. So in 2012, California implemented a top 2 nonpartisan primary system. This was something that passed through a ballot initiative and was championed by Governor Schwarzenegger. And I should say, Schwarzenegger, who is Republican, but a bipartisan coalition, including many Democrats as well, and many other Republicans. And what the California top 2 system does is it holds a nonpartisan primary during the summer in which all the voters in the state of California can participate, and all of the candidates, the Democrats, the Republicans, Green Party, Libertarian, any candidates who are able to get enough signatures to get on the ballot, they compete directly against each other in that primary. And then the top 2 candidates, regardless of their party, the top 2 candidates, the 2 candidates who get the most votes, they're the ones who move on to the general election. Just those 2 candidates. The reason why this there's 2 reasons why this matters. And there's 2 reasons why this is so impactful in ways that just making partisan primaries more open is not quite as impactful. And the first reason is what I said before, that in California, same thing in Washington State, which also has top 2, and same thing is in Louisiana, which has a slightly different system, which I can talk about, but also does not have partisan primaries, which is the key underlying commonality here. What happens is a Democrat or Republican is now in that first stage competing not just with others in their own party, but other candidates from the other party. So that's the first thing that matters, is it changes the competitive landscape in the primaries dramatically, because they're positioning themselves against candidates on that are to their left, to their right, and in the center. And then the second reason why it matters is in deep blue districts, what often happens is 2 Democrats will win the top 2 primary, and in deep red districts, 2 Republicans will be the top 2 candidates who will advance to the general election. And now I realize why, if you're say a Republican in a deep blue district, why you wouldn't like that, having 2 Democrats who advance to the general. Right. You feel boxed out now from the general election. Ironically, that's when you actually have peak political power, because you as that Republican who has to decide between 2 Democrats are going to be, as a voting bloc, determining whether or not the more liberal or the more moderate Democrat wins that general election. And while you might not like those 2 options, the alternative in the alternative partisan primary system was, yes, you get to cast an expressive vote for a Republican in that deep blue district who has no chance of winning in the general election, and then you're left with the Democrat who was best able to win the partisan primary, who's going to be on average more progressive than the moderate Democrat that you can throw your weight behind in the top 2 system.
And what was the strategy with the other article? This one, an antidote for ultra polarized politics. You were looking at Louisiana. Was the suggestion that we follow kind of Louisiana's model where they don't have primaries, at least in that article?
So the Louisiana model is it's similar to the California model in that there are no partisan primaries. It's unique in the sense, so we say that they don't have primaries at all, which is true. They have, I'll call it a first stage election. They have what they call a general election in November when the rest of us are having our general election. And it looks a lot like the top two primary that I just explained in California. All of the candidates run against each other, including, multiple Democrats and multiple Republicans often. And the top two of those candidates advance into a runoff election if nobody secures an outright majority. Now, a lot of times one candidate does get a majority, and so there is no runoff. But in other instances, nobody gets 50% plus one, and so you take the top two candidates and you have a runoff election. And so in that sense, it actually looks a lot like the California model, and the Louisiana general election actually looks a lot like a primary election under top two. The one thing about the Louisiana model that's not ideal is when they hold their runoff elections in December. I think they're December or January. They tend to be very low turnout. And so that's problematic. And, people are thinking, around the holiday season, people have sort of lost, politics has lost their attention to a great deal. And so Louisiana would be better off if it changed the timing of these elections, but otherwise I think that they've got the right idea.
So is it fair to say the general strategy is one way to reduce polarization across America would be to get to change the primary system, go to the jungle primary, the top two partisan primary system built in California? Is that roughly the big idea, that we could take what California's done and Washington's done, which is sort of a version of what Louisiana's done, and we could implement that across 50 states, and that would at least reduce the amount of extreme politicians being able to achieve power, which would reduce the amount of polarization between the two parties?
I think it would. And I'll just quickly point to a few data points to support this. So in Louisiana, they implemented the jungle primary in 1975, and they're the only state that has used a nonpartisan primary for congressional and state level races for a long period of time. Nebraska does something sort of similar for state level races for its unicameral. That's a sort of separate conversation that we can have. But in Louisiana, what we see is now there's political science. Nolan McCarty at the University of Princeton and Boris Shore at the University of Houston, they've created these ideology scores for state legislators, which we use to measure polarization and see how it changes over time and across the states. And mind you, these are two researchers who are skeptical that primaries really matter. However, using their own data, and they would acknowledge what I'm about to say here, but using their own data in the white paper I wrote for Unite America on Louisiana, what I show is that Louisiana has consistently been the second or third least polarized state in the country since Shore and McCarty's score back, as far as it goes back, which is to the mid 1990s.
Boris Shore and Nolan McCarty.
Yeah. So Louisiana, which has used this system for a long time, unfortunately, the state level polarization scores don't go back that far. But if we look at when they start in the 1990s, Louisiana has consistently been one of the least polarized states in the country. California, before it implemented top two, was the most polarized state in the country. The Democratic Party in California is very far to the left compared to Democrats in other states. And the Republican Party is further to the right than many people might realize. California is a bit more sort of rural in many parts than I think a lot of people will realize. However, since it implemented top two, California has actually depolarized. Not a lot, mind you, but it's slightly depolarized over a decade. This is the decade of Obama and Trump and January 6th, and basically every other state in the country became more polarized. Almost every other state, and especially in the Western region. So if you control for the region in which California is, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Texas, Arizona, all of those states became considerably more polarized, more so than any other states in the country. And yet California in that same region was one of only 5 states to actually become a little bit less polarized.
That makes a lot of sense. You can see these other states increasingly becoming more polarized as the rest of America does. And then you're saying, well, California sort of resisted that trend. Why did it resist it? Well, it implemented this major election reform right before. That's a good source of data. I live in California. I live in the rural part of California. I'm a liberal, but I'm surrounded with a lot of conservatives, and I know a lot of Republicans. Some of the concerns about the top two jungle primary reform in California was that, Governor Schwarzenegger did work with Democrats to get implemented. And basically all of the Republican Party feels here that he was duped and that was a bad decision. What's happened is we've become a one-party state. Basically, the Republican Party's become neutered to a level they've never had. They don't really have any real influence anymore. And while that does mean that we're very efficient and effective, like we don't have a problem passing any legislation. So as far as polarization, I've seen the metrics showing California has a very effective legislature because we can pass almost any legislation that we want. Very quickly, just pass it right through. There's not really big debates. But on the other hand, they're saying, if you talk to Republicans out here, they go, well, our party's almost dead. It was basically wiped out with that system. What it is mostly elections between Democrat versus Democrat. If you also talk to libertarians and Bernie Sanders supporters and Green Party supporters and Peace and Freedoms Party supporters, parties on the left, they'll say we were completely wiped out. We used to have some ability to make a point because we could maybe get 1 or 2 people in there and people would listen to us during the primary. Now they know we'll never make it because it's a Democratic Party state. They run the state. They have the money. They can just blow us away with cash. And so what we've seen is a complete wipeout of all third-party opinions and almost the destruction of the second party. Now, you're right. That has reduced polarization. We used to have difficulty getting laws passed. I remember when Pete Wilson was governor and there was a lot of arguing. And now we do have a legislature that doesn't really argue with itself, doesn't really argue with the governor, and gets a lot of legislation passed. But if you talk to anybody who's part of any other liberal party or group, like the Bernie Sanders supporters hate it with a passion out here because the Democratic Party wants nothing to do with them. And it means that they basically have been totally sidelined. So the Democrats have said, well, we could just basically not listen to the third of California that likes Bernie Sanders because we have so much inherent power because of this. We can do that. But you're right. It did get rid of polarization. We don't have big arguments. We're able to pass legislation. But is that a good thing to end up with? Okay, we got rid of polarization, but now every state in America is a one-party state, either red or blue. Wouldn't that create a new level of polarization?
Well, maybe we would call it something else other than polarization, like one-party monopoly.
One-party monopoly states.
Yeah. So, I would say no. That would definitely be problematic. So I mean, and if you look at, I mean, that's what the South was for a century, right? It was the solid South. The Democratic Party was the only game in town.
Right.
And I mean, that didn't go great, for a lot of people, especially if you were black or brown.
True. True. My family got out of Texas. Very true, sir. Very, very true. Good point.
So I would completely agree that we don't want one party monopolies. I would so there's a lot of what you said I agree with, and I'll elaborate on that. I disagree that it's a way to. I disagree that the top two is something that leads to or even exacerbates one party dominance. I take your point that the Republican Party has been weakened in California along the same, and that trend has coincided with the implementation of top two. I'm a bit skeptical that there's a causal relation there. I mean, in Louisiana, the Republican Party is more dominant, but they've had a Democratic governor, and the fact that the Republican Party is more dominant in Louisiana is also just a reflection of the party affiliation of the residents of that state. So I will let me grant you though that I think it's an important empirical question that deserves more analysis of whether or not the relationship between the nonpartisan primary system or the top two system and two-party competition. I will grant you that, I think we still need more research on this. I don't see the evidence pointing towards top two being the source of the demise of one political party or the creation of a monopoly. I will say though that it's bad for third parties. I do think that and in my white paper with Unite America, which I think your viewers would find interesting. You can find it on the Unite America website.
Okay.
I forget the title. If you Google Rich Barton Unite America California top two, you'll find it. But I fully acknowledge that this is one of the potential concerns or weaknesses of the top two system, is that third party candidates have a hard time, right? And I mean, the truth is that third party candidates did not do very well in California before the implementation of top two. However, I did some of this analysis. I forget what the exact numbers are, but something like, they were getting in state California lower house races, general elections, they were getting something like 1% of the vote, or maybe a little bit more than that. And now they're getting like 0.5%. And the reason is that most of them, very few of them make it into the general election. So, but I still think that that's problematic. And if I were a third party organizer or candidate, I would still find that concerning, because even if my candidate didn't really stand a chance in the general election, at least they were running in a general election. At least they were going to be on the ballot. At least that they had that campaign season to go out and get their message. And now under top two, they're shut out from that by and large, because it's pretty much only Democrats and Republicans who win, or who are in the top two of that nonpartisan primary, who go on to the general. And I think you're putting your finger on really sort of a very big and I think difficult, question for us as citizens, about what the solution to our current political crisis should look like. And if you think that the two mainstream parties can be reformed and and moderated, and that working within the current two-party system is one way to have a healthier democracy, then I think the top two makes a lot of sense. If you think that what you need is a multi-party system or an alternative to the Democratic or Republican parties, and that's the only way to reform our system to improve the health of democracy, then top two might not be the answer for you.
That's a good point. So if you are okay with the two-party system, the top two helps. This reform helps to make us more democratic. But if you believe in multi-party democracy, this may not be the best solution. Fair enough. I can say that I have not seen any research on why California became a one-party state. So you're totally right. I haven't seen any academic research proving it. But I have talked to libertarian parties up and down the state. I'm also a liberal, and I've talked to Bernie Sanders supporters in 2016, 2017, literally up and down the state. I talked to all the major people who formed the Bernie Sanders third party, and the people who actually wrote the book and built the Bernie Sanders campaign were all from California. So a lot of his campaign came from here. So I've talked to a lot of Bernie Sanders people here, maybe over 1,000 up and down the state, many libertarian parties. I'm also in the Central Valley in Fresno, which is the last remaining competitive district, I think, of its size in all of America. And it is one of the competitive districts in California where we fluctuate between 51% conservative one election and 51% liberal. So it really is very all the Republicans say, we lost power with that top two thing. Schwarzenegger was duped. Worst possible decision for us. It's a one-party state. And all the Bernie Sanders supporters say, and all the Libertarian parties say, that completely wiped us out. Now, that's their opinion. I get it. That's their opinion. But everybody's saying that who's not a Democrat. And what we're also seeing is a lot of voters saying the favoritism of the Democratic Party, as I understand, has actually gone down because people view it as a uniparty state that dominates things. And so you have people voting for Democrats. The vote share for Democrats has gone up, but the favoritism or love or warm feelings towards the Democratic Party has gone down because the average voter feels they're trapped and they don't have options. That is a hard statistic on that one. So, but you're right. These things happen at the same time. Maybe it's just because of demographic shifts. Maybe it's because of something else and they just happen to co-align. We can't say it's exactly that, but there's a lot of unhappy people here, except for what we call corporate Democrats. So the people who love the Democratic Party, love Hillary Clinton and Barack and Bill Clinton and Joseph Biden, they are all about it and think it's great. The problem is that in California, Bernie Sanders beat Joseph Biden in the Democratic Party by like 25 points. Just beat the hell out of him here in California. And then Bernie Sanders didn't win, and we had a recall election against our governor, and our governor was calling all liberals to come out and help against this recall. And he would have Joseph Biden and Elizabeth Warren speak, but he would never invite Bernie Sanders to come and speak on his behalf. So we have a lot of Bernie Sanders voters here, possibly the most of any state in America, who feel 100% disenfranchised and hated by the Democratic Party and feel like they're being artificially repressed. Now, those are all opinions and those are all feelings, but and it's not proof, but I got to tell you, like, nobody but the corporate Dems is loving this out here from my experience. And it has, according to many people, many liberals and many conservatives made us a one-party state. And they're comparing us to China now. So that's just what I've heard. That's not proof, but that's just observation.
So I think, so I take all what you're saying. I think that there's a few counterpoints. I definitely think that the comparison to, a Chinese one-party state is not a fair comparison. I think that's overstated. But I mean, look, if you ask the Public Policy Institute of California has been surveying people about, do you approve of the direction of the state for decades? And what we've seen is that over the last decade, it's gone up from around 30% to 50% of Californians saying that they approve of the direction of the state. So I have no doubt that there's a lot of people who are dissatisfied with the Democratic Party and with the idea of there being less competition between Democrats and Republicans. But I think that the data on are Californians more or less satisfied with how things are going in their state is more complicated.
Sure.
The other thing I'll say, so the point about the corporate Dems is like, this gets at just a normative, this gets at the issue of like, what is the outcome that we're most worried about? And like normatively, what is it that we should be working towards, right? And if our focus is on polarization, and I'm not here to tell you that should be our number one focus, but that's what a lot of people spend a lot of time talking about and worrying about, and for good reason. If our focus is on reducing polarization, then a more business-friendly Democratic Party isn't that what that looks like? I mean, the Democratic Party in California has shifted towards the center over the last decade. That is part of what it means for the party to have moderated. And there's actually Eric McGee has done good research on this, who actually looks at the substance of what Democrats are doing, and he finds that the Democratic Party has become more business friendly under top two. And so, yeah,
No,
I mean, if
true.
you think
I've heard that.
Yeah. So, so this gets at I think at a difficult sort of normative question of like, what is it that we're working towards? But I think if you're somebody who's saying like polarization is what we're worried about, we should want the parties to be more representative of the general public and more, and that is more moderate by and large, then we're saying that, well, we don't want the Democratic Party to be more corporate. I think we have to ask ourselves, like, is there an inconsistency in what we're looking for then? Or do we have to sort of pick one or the other, right? I don't think a Democratic Party in California that looks more like a Bernie Sanders party is a less polarized system, right? That's going to be that would be an equation. That would be a feature of a more polarized California.
It easily could be. However, it's hard to tell people that democracy is working when in the Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders beat Biden by like 25, just a huge slacking amount of points. I mean, just beat the pants off the man. And then to tell people, yeah, but we're not going to talk about Bernie Sanders' ideas or anything to do with him or even have him out here. But you guys won and your party won. It's not, it feels hollow to a lot of people. We frankly have more Bernie Sanders supporters than we do Joseph Biden supporters. And yet and that's a hard fact. And yet the California Democratic Party will have absolutely nothing to do with the man. And people feel a little bit disenfranchised by that. We also, I mean, they started, you can date the articles in the LA Times and San Francisco Chronicle of them talking about the Republican Party's dead. They started after they implemented this jungle primary system. I mean, that's not just Republicans, that's newspapers also discussing that. But you're right. It has shown more moderation. It's a more of a business-friendly Democratic Party. But I got to tell you, when Californians wanted to have universal health care, and the Democratic Party was pushing that forward, and the California Nurses Association, which has helped many people get elected into office here. And then all of a sudden they backed out the day before they were going to sign it. And they did the same thing with the BLM reform. So Black Lives Matter movement got started here in California. Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza are both from California, got started here. And so one of the most aggressive forms of police reform to stop Black people being shot unnecessarily by the police was going to be here. And then again, the California Democratic Party, the corporate wing, modified the legislation the day before. BLM pulled out all of their support and they passed it anyways and said it was good. So Californians are a kind of a super lefty place. And when they look at these things that the public wanted and then they don't get, they're like, that doesn't feel like the democracy we wanted. You know, a lot of us wanted this and we didn't get it.
So I don't know anything about the Black Lives Matter bill in California, but I'm skeptical that Californians want universal health care. I'm skeptical that if you survey them, that's what the majority want. But even if they do, I mean, that would be hugely disruptive to the California economy. And so I think it's unfair to paint like anybody who's not a pro universal healthcare Democrat as a corporate Democrat. I think there's more nuance there. Like, you know, Vermont is the only state to have tried to implement its own universal healthcare system as an individual state, and it abandoned it within a few years. I mean, it is very difficult to finance. You have to worry about capital flight if you're increasing taxes that much. But also, I mean, a sixth of our economy is the healthcare industry. And, you know, President Obama talked about if we could start a system from scratch, it'd probably be a single payer system, but we can't start that system from scratch. And we know from the experience of you know, NAFTA, that when the Democratic Party tries, like, opens up a reform that's going to radically disrupt the U.S. economy and promises to do the education and job training to make up for it, that it hasn't been able to do that. Those policies are very difficult to do. And you're talking about displacing a lot of workers in California with if you were to implement a universal healthcare system. So, I mean, which is to say that this is a totally healthy debate that should be had. But I don't think that any Democrat who took a move against implementing a universal healthcare system was sort of captured by the corporate interest or corporate wing of the party or anything like that. I think it's a lot more complicated.
60% of the California voting base supported universal healthcare, so it was the clear majority. Just putting that out there. And I understand we can talk about that, but I'm living here. And I know what people are saying. They felt duped. They felt tricked. Anthony Rendon was the guy pushing it. And then the day before he backed out. If you talk to the California Nurses Association, which nobody gets elected here without their support, they felt that they were turned on. And we do have a lot of polling showing a lot of people in California wanted this, the majority, and they didn't get it. That's not good for democracy. You're right. People could be out of work. It could be disruptive. It's exceptionally expensive. Big criticism was a lot of Californians didn't realize how expensive it is. True. But democracy is kind of getting what you want when a majority wants it. And I think it was former presidential candidate, the one who went against John Kerry, was in Europe. And they go, but what about when democracy makes bad decisions? He goes, it's still democracy. It's the people's right to choose. I'll leave it there, but these are some concerns people have here with the top two system. It's not universally liked. It's not universally seen as good. And that goes both on the right and on the left. And California has become even more hardcore blue since this. So we've kind of gone, we're effectively a uniparty state. Effectively. I know unfair to compare it to China, but
sure. I mean, there are Republicans in the state, right? There's Republican members of Congress. There's a Republican caucus in the state assembly. The Speaker of the House is a Republican from California.
True.
And California didn't implement. Like, I don't think top two was the reason why. I mean, even if I agreed that Californians wanted or should want. I mean, I take you at your word of your polling, but I think if Californians were a bit more informed, I'm skeptical that they would really want universal healthcare as opposed to other alternatives to incrementally getting there. But that's its own long story. My point is, I don't think top two is the reason why that failed. I mean, it didn't pass. California didn't implement top two before. I'm sorry, didn't implement a single payer system before top two. And True. Other states, regardless of their primary system, have not. No other states have implemented a universal healthcare system, even though it does poll pretty well.
True.
And so I guess I would just close by saying, like, yes, the Democratic Party has become more dominant in the state. I think if that is a direct result of top two, then I think that that's something worth being concerned about. I'm not convinced that it is a direct result. I would also say, as the Democratic Party has become more dominant, we're both talking about ways in which it has become more appealing towards centrists and Republican voters. And so I think, these things are complicated, but that also matters. The Republican Party has been weakened as the Democratic Party has moved a bit more in the direction of the ideological side of Republicans.
Okay, that's fair. And I really, really loved that you were able to explain the debate between some people who had said primaries aren't the cause of polarization and your new research, and that you were able to show, well, they were looking at it before, there's a change after the Tea Party, and then I was able to look at something different. They were looking at kind of a general observation of states, and I was able to look at the finite detail of the information and show there has been definitely an increase over the last couple of decades of fear of being primary challenged. And that's hard data. I mean, that's definitely there. And I totally buy that. I think we're getting polarized, and I do think politicians are getting more scared. I mean, nobody was talking about the things Trump was talking about until after he won an election and they couldn't get rid of him for the first 2 years. And then everybody in the Republican Party was like, oh yeah, let's talk about that because it's winning, right? Even Hillary Clinton talked about universal health care and free college tuition only because Bernie Sanders talked about it. She hated the idea and trashed it. And then when he kept talking about it and growing, well, now guess who's talking about it? And now Biden has to keep talking about it. So you're absolutely right. There's definitely a link between these extreme candidates getting out there and then pulling things further to the extremes. Joseph Biden has famously criticized the extreme liberal wing of the Democratic Party for backing the defund the police movement. He said that was not good for this. That was an extremist position, not good for the Democratic Party. And he was more moderate, and he did beat out Bernie Sanders. And so you did get more of a moderate influence instead of the extreme. Absolutely agree with all that. Last two questions.
Yeah, go for it.
You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person who's watching this interview, and they're saying to themselves, wow, I learned a lot about political primaries, how they've changed, how they're the problem, what's the differences in the academic field, but I'm struggling to remember it all. But there was this one thing that the professor said, and it's 5 days after I've watched this video, and I can't stop thinking about this one thought the professor had. What is that one thought you want an imaginary person you'll never actually meet to not be able to stop thinking about 5 days after watching this video, while the rest of the video is a little bit foggy? The one major thought.
And it's for somebody who's a third party, who's interested in the third party. Is that what you said?
No, it's a person who's not you or me. You'll never meet. It's a hypothetical person you'll never meet, right? And you have like a minute to explain to them what's the most important thing.
Within the context of our conversation, when you said third party,
I'm sorry. That's my bad. I apologize. Not third party. A third party person, not an advocate for a third party. Third party person, imaginary person you'll never meet, but you have the ability to get an idea in their head that they can't get out. What is that idea you want for someone you'll never actually meet?
Yeah. So I think I would say that I would go back to the last chunk of the conversation that we had, which I thought was really rich. And I would sort of try to put it concisely as something that somebody, can remember 5 days from now. I can't remember anything I did 5 days ago, but if you think the urgency of the crisis of American democracy is so great that we really need immediate reform, the fastest way and the proven way that we can do that is through nonpartisan primaries. And that's going to look like reforming the two existing parties and working within that system by moderating those parties, by making them more liberal in the classical sense, committed to a liberal democracy. And I think that nonpartisan primary reforms are a way to do that in a fast period of time, and it's something that's politically feasible. Now, if you don't think that it's possible for us to have a healthy democracy with any iteration of the Democratic or Republican Party, then I think you should explore other alternatives, whether it's, a proportional representation system that someone like Lee Drutman at New America is arguing for. You could look at the top 4 system in Alaska, which takes the top 4 candidates and puts them in the general election, given more space for third-party candidates. And by the way, third-party candidates have done better in Alaska under top 4 than they have under top 2.
Huh.
You can also look at fusion voting. Now I'm going on too long, but yeah, there's the takeaway is, if you think we need immediate reform because the crisis of American democracy is so great, then I think implementing nonpartisan primaries is a proven, politically feasible reform that we can do. If you either don't think the problem is that immediate, or you think the problem is so great that we need to burn down the barn and rebuild from scratch, then I would look towards these other alternatives like proportional representation. And I can't tell you which one to pick, because I think that's a normative decision. I'm clearly more comfortable with a corporate Democratic Party than maybe you or your listeners are, and I'm not going to tell people that I'm right and they're wrong on that. That's a moral position that they have to come to.
Fair enough. And I really appreciate you being willing to take on theoretical, experimental questions. As I've always told people, I know that it's difficult for people in academia. You're trained to look at, this is what the data shows. Don't say anything that the data doesn't show. And that's what you're supposed to do. That's your training. But we're trying to get the public to understand, and sometimes they need theoretical or what if? And what if we painted it blue instead of red? And what does it look like? That helps the public understand. So I really appreciate you being able to be open and engage in some creative debates. It really does help the public understand. The point of the show is for understanding. It's not necessarily to make a point. And these debates help people see, oh, okay, I can see it like that. Or maybe it's like this. And like, I think we concluded that there's a lack of data. We need more data. We need more research.
Yeah.
We need more research on, I think both of you, we agree, we need more research on the primary system. What does it do? How does it do it?
We need more experimentation. We need different kinds of reforms that we can get that data from.
We both agree on that. And I think we both agree there is a problem. It does need a fix. This is a very promising solution. But when we only have 3 states doing it, Louisiana, sort of, Washington and California, there's not enough data coming in. We need, like I think you're saying, more states trying, more experiments, more data, and more studies on this to know better. Is that fair?
That's right.
Okay. Well, then my work is done here. Last question. You don't have to ask. You don't have to answer. Besides Taylor Swift, is there anyone you would recommend that we could interview? You don't have to name anybody, but we always ask if there's any recommendations. We try to keep the conversation going. We'll reach out to Miss Swift and see if she wants to be part of the conversation. If she denies us, or she's already booked with another concert, is there some other people we should look into, in your opinion?
Marcus, if you can get Taylor Swift, I would highly recommend. Okay. But otherwise, I mentioned Lee Drutman at New America. I would recommend Lee Drutman at New America, because we agree a lot on the diagnosis of the problem. But he maybe I shouldn't recommend him, because I think you'll find that some things will resonate with his take. He thinks we need a proportional representation system, and that we need to create a multi-party system and get out of what he calls the 2-party doom loop. I'm more optimistic that we can successfully reform the existing party structure. And similar to my point on universal healthcare, if we could start from scratch, I would build a single-payer healthcare system in the United States, and I would do proportional representation with multi-parties if it was me. But for me, we can't start from scratch, and so I look at it differently based on that.
Right.
But he will have a different take. Even he'll have a different solution, even though we have very similar diagnoses. And I think he'd be a great guest.
Thank you. I will reach out to him. We will reach out to him. And I totally agree. There's a difference between, and I do this with a lot of the professors. I go, if you had a magic wand, what would you do? And half of them take it, but the other half goes, there's not a magic wand, man. Like, what's the point of even answering that question? I'm not going to be able to just go, poof, 200 million people now start hugging each other in the streets and don't hate people on the other side. And poof, there's 2 new constitutional amendments, right? We haven't been able to pass that in 70, 100 years that do these things. And so some of them go, like you said, if I could draw it on my own, I would do those things. But what do I think we're actually going to achieve in America in the next couple of years and maybe 10 years with political reform? And those are 2 different categories of answers I've seen. We can't travel back in time, and we cannot go back and make it a tabula rasa. Nobody's God. Nobody has a magic wand. There's a limit to the kind of reforms we're going to be able to pull off. And I think you're thinking in the right direction. We need to stop with the fantasy thinking, or at least recognize that it is somewhat more fantastical, and be looking at that. What are we actually going to be able to possibly do here? You got to get this passed through Congress. And a lot of professors have said multi-party system. I've seen that. The problem is that will never happen unless the 2 parties agree they don't need to be the only 2 parties in the country. Why would they ever agree to that? They lose. They both lose. So you have to get the people who run the whole thing to go, yeah, we want to lose and be less politically powerful.
Totally agree.
Probably not going to happen.
Yeah, totally agree.
We'll leave it there.
This was a fantastic. This was a great interview, Marcus. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. We try to do some good information, some stuff people aren't going to see otherwise. I really appreciate it. I will let you go, Professor. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Keep up the good work.
I will email you a copy of the video shortly, and we'll go from there. And I really appreciate you coming out today.
That sounds great. Have a great day.
All right, you too. Thank you.
Thanks.